This is Ask a Couples Counsellor, a show that answers all the relationship questions you're too afraid to ask. On the show, we'll take your questions and give you the tools you need to build trust and intimacy with your partner. I'm your host, Neha Kapoor. I'm a registered clinical counsellor and psychotherapist, and I'm really passionate about helping couples navigate the challenges that we all go through. Because after all, every relationship encounters some stormy weather now and then. Hello and welcome to Ask a Couples Counsellor. Before we begin, I want to let you know that today's episode includes discussions about infidelity, grief, and the loss of a loved one in an accident. If these bring up difficult emotions for you, please take care of yourself first and either skip this episode or listen at a time that you feel ready. For confidentiality reasons, the name and voice of the individual featured in this episode have been altered. When we think about relationships, we often picture them ending in either a happily ever after or heartbreak. But today, I'm joined by someone whose story is much more layered. I have had the privilege of working with this client over the last 5 years to navigate the highs and lows of relationships and personal growth. Her journey is filled with love, heartbreak, and loss. But through it all, she has displayed an inspiring degree of strength and resilience. Her story is a powerful testament to the human spirit ability to endure and rebuild. I believe it will touch you as it's touched me and remind you of your own strength and capacity for growth. Let's dive into her remarkable journey. Hi, Petra. Thank you for being on the show and for your courage in sharing your journey with us today.
Thank you for having me.
When you first came to me 5 years ago, there was an end of a significant relationship in your life, a 5-year journey that had such a profound impact on your life. And it was a pivotal moment that had marked the beginning of your journey towards healing and growth. So can you maybe take us back to that time? What happened and what was life like for you in those early days?
That's such a long time ago now when I think about it. I just remember, feeling completely lost is probably the best way to describe it. I had no sense of who I was. I had no identity, really. I think that's the best way to say it. I had no identity. And I just knew I needed guidance at that point. I didn't know what my likes were, what my dislikes were. Everything was so consumed by that relationship and the prospects that it held for me. And all of a sudden that was taken away by circumstance. And it just left me in a state of limbo.
I know that the initial chapter of a relationship is quite exciting and it's full of promise. So why did that initial chapter feel so full of promise for you?
Because so much was promised.
Tell us about it. What was promised? Take us back to the beginning of your story. What happened?
I think it was just the timing felt right. I was towards the end or the middle of my university degree, and Nathan came to me at a time where I felt ready for a committed relationship. I think it also had a lot to do with, obviously, the culture expectations where, at 22 years old, this is the time where you're going to make a commitment, you're going to meet someone and start working towards the fairy tale, right? The building of a family or the getting engaged, the marriage, the building of a family, the house, the whole works.
So when you say that, there were some cultural barriers or expectations, I suppose, what's your cultural background, if you don't mind us telling us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so my family, we're from Eastern Europe. And I think it's just like an expectation that once you kind of finish high school and once you start kind of developing some sort of a career for yourself, well, it's time to settle down and step into that role of being like a woman for a house. And it very much applies the same to the men as well. Just in their sense, they probably have a little bit more leniency as to when they can do that. And I can't say that my family or my parents per se were too strict on that. They've always encouraged me to get an education and to form something from myself first. But I definitely felt like I was expected to do that. I had that expectation for myself.
Why did you feel that? Like, why was that an expectation of yourself?
It's because I've seen it my whole life.
Right.
Everywhere around me, because we were so involved in our community and whatnot, it's just what you saw and you expected that. I placed those expectations for myself. So it felt like the right thing to do at the time. I don't have regrets now, looking back. If you asked me this question 3 years ago, I'd say, yeah, I have heaps.
So Nathan kind of came with the promise of what your expectation was and what you were expected to do.
Yeah, and fulfilling those expectations for sure.
So tell us, what was that fairy tale like? Where did it begin? What happened? What was the honeymoon phase like?
We actually met when I was 16 years old. And yeah, through mutual friends. And it wasn't anything at that time, but I'd known him for a very long time. And we didn't really start kind of connecting on a romantic level till I was about 20, I'd say. And then it was around 22 where we made it official. So when he came in, like, he just had such a great charisma. His energy was so masculine, and I was really attracted to his aura, so to speak.
And was there anything particular about him that appealed to you, about his aura, his charisma?
Definitely his sense of humour. I have a sense of humour, I like to think, so it was nice to be able to share that with someone. And then on an intellectual level, it was great to have conversations with someone in depth. And I think that's what connected us the most. And then obviously things like physical attraction came into play as well.
Which are all natural parts of, I suppose, the honeymoon phase, right? Oxytocin is running high, you're connecting with somebody. It's an exciting phase of a relationship. There's novelty, there's excitement.
Yeah, definitely.
So when you're looking back, would you say there were any early signs that things might take a different turn than you'd hoped?
No, but I didn't know any better either. I just took everything for face value.
And how do you think that the story kind of unfolded as the honeymoon phase kind of passed and you were getting into the more serious territory?
At one point it was fine, I'd say. After we surpassed that honeymoon phase where you're so involved with one another and, everything's quite giddy and happy and I miss yous and the I love yous have passed, there was talk about, okay, where to from here? Are we going to be looking at, moving out together, or is the next step for us to get engaged and then to get married? There definitely was conversations like that. So it felt like it was all going in that direction, which kept that promise, right?
And when you say that, it kept that promise, where do you think that things kind of started to change?
Well, when there was a shift in the behaviour.
So tell us a little bit more about what was the shift.
I first noticed when he had started becoming a little bit distant with me. He was quite agitated through his work, and that kind of started becoming like reflected onto me. Very short fuse arguments over really silly kind of things.
What kind of things? What do you think couples generally argue about?
Well, I know what I argued about for sure was one of the biggest ones was I would come over to spend some quality time with him and he'd just be so tired from work, supposedly, and he'd just fall asleep, sleep right through it. So I felt like I wasn't getting that quality time. And then it was things like, we're not spending time where we're giving each other this undivided attention. No more date nights, no more going out for dinners or going away on weekends away. It somehow all just became like if we're going out, we're going to meet up with other people, or we're going because someone's invited us out.
So there was no that one-on-one interaction?
No. And I remember maybe a pivotal moment it was our anniversary. I think this was around the 4-year or 5-year mark. And we were meant to go out for dinner that night. And he's like, oh, but there's, X, Y, and Z have called us over to their place. They're having a little get together at theirs. We're going to go there instead. And I think at that point I realized, okay, something needs to change because this is starting to hurt my feelings. You're not making any priority, like you're not prioritizing me.
And did you ever speak to him about those issues early on in the relationship? Like, how did you initially respond to the challenges that you'd noticed?
I think at first I didn't speak. I just always thought that things would correct themselves because you hold on to like what was. and you hold on to but it never was like this. So he's just going through something. He's really stressed at work. He's, showing signs of a bit of depression or whatever it is. It will level out. But then obviously when it got to a point where I was finding myself increasingly frustrated, I'd definitely voice them. But they'd also be shut down quite quickly. I was the one that was being dramatic about things, or it'd be followed up with like another empty promise, as in, okay, we won't go, this time we're going to go here, but don't worry, next week you and I are going to spend time here and there. Or whatever it was that I was asking for. No, I won't fall asleep tonight. Tomorrow night I'll stay up. And it all seems, like I said, so silly now. But I think when you've been so starved of connection
and attention
that you'll take anything you can get, even if that does mean him staying up for an extra 20 minutes before bedtime just to have a conversation without any screens or TV or whatever. Or even if that does mean, take me to your local McDonald's and let's get a drive-through meal and have dinner like that. Like, I think, my own standards for myself completely dropped.
And that's important to note, right? That in any relationship, for any of us, standards start to drop as time goes on. And, we're so busy trying to accommodate for the other person's needs that we start to forget about our own. So when you think about that, what was the most difficult part of navigating the challenges in your relationship, do you think?
For me, I was always compensating for his feelings over my own.
Which is a very natural thing that happens with couples, yes.
Yeah, and because there was this element of such a behavioural change in him where he really was displaying, kind of depressive symptoms, states of like mania, then states of deep depression, I just found that I was tiptoeing around any kind of my own disdain in the relationship because this was a bigger issue at hand. And I felt responsible to help him out of his own depression rather than to put the focus on the relationship that took precedence. So I think that was the hardest part.
So when you say that, he was in depression or he was having periods of mania, how did you kind of reach that conclusion, or like what was it that you kind of thought? Because everybody nowadays, kind of diagnoses, yes. This is a very normal part in couples, right? Everybody is diagnosing everyone these days. He's a narcissist and he's got depression and he's got mania, whatever. They're bipolar. So when you say that, was that a feeling? Was it something that he was diagnosed with, or was that something that you thought fitted the criteria of it? Like what was it that kind of led you to believe that was what was happening for him?
Well, I'm that type of person that I'm an intellect, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I
know that about you, yes.
So I always think when I don't understand something, I need to go and educate myself about that. And as soon as, like I said, I noticed this shift in behavior, in mannerisms and whatever, I started paying attention to the pattern in his behavior. At what moments is he kind of expressing an attitude of hyperactivity, impulsiveness, wanting to go out and, go out till strange hours in the morning? And what were the periods of time where he was just happy to stay at home and disconnect completely by binge watching TV shows? Where did his eating go wrong? Like I turned into a full psycho at this point, investigator. Do you know what I mean?
That's also a very common thing that people do, yes.
So I started analysing these patterns and then I started doing my readings. Okay, so let's start with the most common one, which I think out of mental health, depression's probably one of the most that's commonly spoken about. And that's where it, made sense. I remember reading this scholarly article and it was saying things like people go through phases of mania and then depressive episodes. I'm like, this makes sense. It's between 10 weeks and then maybe 2 weeks of mania, but it can vary from individual to individual. And I was like, okay, that's kind of sounding right. And from there, I was like, okay, like you're depressed.
And so you gave him a diagnosis and then what happened?
Well, we definitely spoke about it because there were, certain situations in his life that would contribute to, him having depression. And then it was like me trying to encourage him to get the help that he needs.
And what was that like for you? Because I know that a lot of clients find that challenging when their partner is going through depression or they're going through, any kind of a personality disorder. They don't know exactly how to support them. So did you have any challenges?
I was exhausted.
Mm. And how did this turmoil kind of affect you personally and emotionally and mentally and even physically?
Well, the exhaustion physically, I don't think I had time to really think about my own mental state at that point. I noticed definitely physically, as in I was always tired. I was very sensitive to a lot of things external to my relationship. Things would trigger me to get upset quite quickly. And I think probably one of the most notable things, I was irritable. And my family picked up on that the most. For someone who's so positive and likes to look at the world as half full rather than half empty, I became very pessimistic, very short fused. I was getting very sensitive, irritable, and I was crying a lot. And I felt very misunderstood. I didn't feel heard by anyone.
So when you say you felt misunderstood, what do you mean by that?
I think because, again, if we link it to our culture, depression doesn't exist.
Yes. And I suppose that would be true for a lot of cultures, right?
It's not real. And you just get on with your life.
So you felt that you were kind of getting into the depressive state as well?
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't have admitted it at the time, but I was very depressed.
And then what did you kind of decide to do about this? Like, were you reaching out for help or did you speak to him or?
To him, yes.
Okay. And what did he say?
Well, I didn't speak to him about my own state of mind in that sense. I didn't know I was depressed at the time. I think I was just in full fight or flight mode. Get me out of this situation. Let's get him out of this situation so we can go back to that fairy tale that we have been constructing this whole time. Just take me back there because that's where I want to be.
How are you going to get back there?
I don't know. We're going to get this.
Because it's a fairy tale, right?
Yeah, fairy tales come true.
Exactly.
That's what we've been led to believe, right?
That's right. That's right. And what happened when this fairy tale wasn't coming true? When did reality hit?
It hit when the behavior didn't change, when I realized that nothing was changing and I was completely depleted. I just remember having a moment where I was like, you are ruining yourself, and at what cost? And that you can't help anyone or support anyone if you yourself are completely damaged.
And that you was you or that you was Nathan?
That you was me.
And then what happened? What did you decide thereafter?
Well, that's when we had the conversation. Well, I started the conversation. We had another massive argument and we had met up the next day and I was like, I can't do this anymore. And it's clearly not working. And I remember telling him that he needs to look after himself and he needs to put the focus into himself to become a better man so that he then can go and catch up with that fairy tale, whether it's with me or with someone else, so that he can live a normal life. And I decided the same thing for myself.
So you decided to call it quits with him. And this was 5 years on?
Yes, 5 years on.
And how did you push through these moments? Like, how did you get through that? Because I know that calling it quits with anybody, whether it's you walking out of the relationship or the other person ending it, is very difficult.
I think resilience is something that's always been taught to me. I know I have a strong support system at home. Even though we don't understand each other all the time, I just knew that even with those foundations, I'd be able to get through anything.
So when we talk about resilience, where do you think you get that from? Because it's really hard to build resilience, right? It's not that easy. And I suppose that's what I really like about you, and I have admired it, that you are quite resilient. And where do you think and how do you think that's been built in you?
Maybe it is just my upbringing. I haven't had a difficult childhood. When I say difficult childhood, like I've always had a roof over my head. I was driven to and from school. I had stability in my childhood.
And I think that's really important, right? Because stability builds resilience too.
Yeah.
And a lot of people think that resilience is built through hardship, but that's not always the case.
Yeah. So there were certain things that I could always expect from home. Like I knew that when I came home from school at whatever it was, 4 p.m., that there would be a meal. Like I never missed a dinner. I never missed a lunchtime, a breakfast. I was never without anything at home. And I knew that my dad would come home at 6 p.m. on weeknights, and that on a weekend he'd come home at 11 p.m.
So there was predictability and stability.
Yeah. And I think, my mum has always just kind of raised me to not dwell on things, and that somehow things will always work out, even if we don't understand it. My mum's quite a faithful person, and she does often talk in terms of like God and his plan for us.
So faith is an important thing.
Yeah. And I mean, my relationship with faith has changed, over the years, but I think I just always believed that I'm capable of getting through something that's quite challenging at the time, because there'd be something more for me after that.
What's that? What's
I
that
don't
more?
know. Whatever it is.
Whatever it is. So something good that can come out of it. Yes.
Yeah. And I think I've always just believed in the fact that, these challenges that we go through life, they shape you. So even though I am uncomfortable at the moment, I know that I can look back on these situations in 10 years' time, or even less, in a couple of years' time, and be like, I'm grateful for what I've learned here, because I wouldn't be the person that I am today if I hadn't gone through that.
That's right. And so I suppose when we fast forward a little bit, so 5 years have gone by and you've ended this relationship, and that's where you call me. And I still remember our very first phone call. There was a diagnosis in that phone call too that you thought that Nathan had, which was probably bipolar, from what I remember.
Correct. At that point, I'd done a deep dive. Yeah.
Right. And you told me a little bit about that and why you were coming to see me. And that's where our journey began. So tell us what happened from there on in, because your story did take a turn.
Well, I remember our first session quite clearly, and all I did was cry. I think the first 4 sessions was me just bawling my eyes out in your room.
And it was a very difficult time for you.
Yeah, because everything was still so raw, and I'd very much been holding on to a lot of hope. Like, our separation still felt quite temporary. And I think because the way we left off, it was like, you're going to go and, help yourself, and I'm going to go and help myself, and then we're going to come back together and it's going to be excellent. It's going to be even better and even stronger and more beautiful than it was when we, started off.
And what transpired after that? Tell us a little bit about that, because I think that's where, there was a period where he was in your life.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we never really had time to do what we set out to do, because we stayed with one another anyway. After we initially broke up, we still stayed in contact, and he went through this weird phase where he was supporting me through my breakup and I was supporting him through his breakup with one another. Like, it was so strange.
And how do you do that?
It makes no sense. But like, I'd call him being upset about, the fact that we've broken up, and he'd be comforting me about that, and vice versa. He'd be upset that we broke up.
And what would he say to you, or what would you say to him?
He would say things like, it's for the best, and we're doing this so we can become better people, and if all works out the way it's meant to work out, we'll find each other again. And I suppose I was saying the same things and just encouraging him to get help and still checking in on his mental health. Yeah, but he wasn't doing that for himself at the time.
And how long did you kind of continue this, supporting each other?
Oh my God, like another 2 years.
So you were supporting each other through a breakup for 2 years?
Okay, maybe not 2 years. I'd say maybe like 6 months before we actually kind of fell back into this pattern with each other.
So you started reconnecting again?
Yeah, started seeing each other more often, going over to his place. Although it was an awkward time because it was COVID as well.
Mm-hmm.
So my area was in that lockdown where you couldn't leave, what was it, like 5 kilometers.
That was a difficult time for a lot of people.
Yeah, and he had a little bit more liberty because of his line of work, which enabled him to move around more. So he was coming past my place to drop off coffees and, little gifts and whatnot, breakfasts, because I was working from home. And everything was extremely censored as in I didn't let anyone in my family know what I was doing.
And why was that?
Well, firstly, I think I couldn't be bothered for the conversations that would arise from that. And secondly, I wanted to be like certain that it was going to work out this time before I went and spoke to my family about it.
And was it working out?
When you're in La La Land.
Is that how you felt you were? You were in La La Land again?
Well,
so
100%.
You were there with the fairy tale again?
Yeah, 100%. It was being sold to me again. It was amazing. What do you mean? I was getting all this attention, all those things that I wasn't getting. Here it is again. Do you know what I mean? The attention, the phone calls, the compliments, you name it. It was all there in the palm of my hand.
So it was an addiction?
Yeah, 100%. But thankfully, also in that period of time, I was still consistently seeing you.
Yes. And what was happening there? Do you remember?
Well, you were throwing buckets of cold water on my face, and I didn't really like that.
So tell us a little bit about that cold water that I was throwing on your face.
Well, you're telling me to recognize the patterns of behavior, which is really interesting. I was so good at finding them out when it was something I wanted to see. But when it came to like kind of diagnosing the patterns in my relationship, I didn't want a bar of it.
And why do you think we do that? Because that's a very common thing for a lot of people to do. I know I've certainly done that in relationships in the past too. And what do you think is in that moment? Why do we do that?
Hey, you know what? Hope. I'm going to throw that one in. Hope's the biggest one. It's like, don't you dare come in here and shatter this opportunity that's presenting itself to me.
It's hope.
It's hope and it's desire. I want that. And this is what I want. And this is where I've invested myself emotionally.
And an emotional investment comes at a cost, right?
Massive.
So what do you think happened when I was throwing those cold buckets of water on your face?
It was a healthy dose of reality. No, I think it just kept me grounded. And like at that point, I definitely needed to be grounded a lot. I got very easily swept up in things. Yeah, so it did help me notice the patterns in the sense that this felt all too good to be true right now. And if something is too good to be true, that usually means that it is too good to be true.
And then what happened? Because it was too good to be true, right?
So we continued, seeing each other even once like the COVID restrictions were lifted. And I kept, pushing forward for, okay, like, what are we? I was having this conversation with a man that I'd been with at this point for 7 years. Do you know what I mean? What are we? When are we going to make it official? When am I going to start seeing your family again? And when are we going to start making those next steps towards this future that we're building with each other? Because there was, conversations about moving in together and all that stuff.
Building a life together.
Yeah, building a life together. And it just kept being put on the back burner. He'd always say things like, I'm just not ready right now. I still have things to work on myself. I need to sort out my mental health. I need to sort out my alcohol addiction. I'm going to go to rehab and all this stuff. And again, I found myself, slotting in quite comfortably into that supporter, caretaker position again.
And did that say something about you or that said something about him, do you think?
I think it said a lot about me. I had a savior complex.
And what's that?
Codependency.
So you felt like you were codependent on him?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I just, again, wanted to make sure that he was okay. However, this time, again, because I had your support, it was different.
What was different?
I hadn't allowed myself to get completely immersed in it, where I became ignorant of everything around me. I started questioning things a lot more. And I think that's really important, that in these situations where there is so much emotional intensity, and I always like to say, high emotion is low intelligence.
Why do you say that?
Think about the times where you're even really happy about something. I don't know, say you're out on a night out and you're super excited and whatnot. Well, you're not going to have the intelligence to really slow down your drinking. And you might get completely hammered and regret it the next day. Or even when you're extremely emotional and upset about something, or you're angry, you tend to say things that you don't really mean. But if you had just taken a moment to kind of step away from those emotions, take a breather and think about it logically, well, you can avoid yourself all these crises.
And do you think that happened for you this time around?
Not as much. There definitely were points of it, but I was able to kind of assess things with a more clear mind. But that's because I was getting that clarity in the space that you held for me in therapy. It was like I'd be in this world, and I think at that point I was seeing you every 2 weeks to 3 weeks. It was still quite consistent.
Regularly, yeah.
Regular, yeah. And I'd leave a session with you. I had all this clarity and I'd go and apply that. And then a little bit of time would pass where I'd be showered, fall back into an old pattern. And then I'd come to you again. And it's like, all right, here's that bucket of ice cold water again. Go try that again. You know what I mean? Go learn your lesson. And yeah, it got to a point where I started demanding, and I became very clear about what I wanted. And that's something that you helped me realize, what it was that I stood for and what it was that I wanted. And to have the courage to step away from things that no longer serve me a purpose. I think that's one of the biggest lessons I've learned through our sessions together.
And that's really the client's journey, right? It's not my job to take over your journey. It's my job to let you go through that journey and be there as a support, right? And give you that cold bucket of water and say, okay, now what are you going to do with it? And go out and try again. And, you know, it's about being human, and we're all a little bit messy, and that's okay. So now this is kind of happened. It's happening. And then you've gotten really clear about, okay, this is what I stand for. This is what I want. This is what I'm demanding. And I assume that Nathan at this point isn't ready to give you that.
Yeah, he wasn't.
Okay. And tell us what happened then. And you're like 2 years in, right? After the breakup, where you're supporting each other.
Yes. So at this point, I had told him that we're not to contact each other anymore, and that this time it's truly time to step away from this because it's not working. To me, this felt like the real breakup. The first time around didn't even feel like a real breakup because I was so distraught by it. And like I said, there was that hope. Whereas this time around, I felt like a lot of that hope had dissipated for me.
Why do you think it dissipated?
Because the pattern of his behavior wasn't changing. And it became really apparent to me that it wasn't going to change. And not just that, my own sense of self-worth had started developing finally, where I wasn't going to tolerate things that I didn't feel I deserved. And it was only a sliver at the time, believe it or not. I barely had any even at that point, but it was enough to make me step away from that and realize that I want more for myself for the second time round in this.
And so you truly stepped back? Do you think you truly stepped back?
Yeah, I definitely stepped back. Nathan kept trying to reach out on the odd occasion, like, for Christmas, he'd send a message, or it would be something like, oh, I watched this movie and I thought of you. You should watch it. You'd really like it. Anything to kind of make contact. And I had ignored most and then gently reminded him always, we agreed. Well, I don't want to keep talking to you, blah, blah, blah.
And there were many moments like that.
Yeah, it'd be like, 2-week intervals where he'd reach out.
And this was kind of carrying on for a period of time too, from what I remember.
Yeah, it was carrying on for at least 3 or 4 months. And then in the new year, it was around February. It would have been February of 22. He had called me and he was very erratic on the phone and profusely apologizing. And I remember him just constantly saying to me, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry, I'm such a liar. I've been lying to you. I'm such a liar. And I was like, well, what have you been lying about? And he's like, oh, just everything. Like, I'm such a liar. And I could tell that, he had been out drinking. And I said, where are you? And he goes, I'm in the city. I said, okay. I said, make sure that you get an Uber home. Don't drive home. And perhaps once you sober up, you can give me a phone call and actually tell me what it is that you've been lying to me about, because I deserve to know. And in the meantime, the bartender kind of came in the back of that conversation and she's like, oh, can I get you another drink, sir? And he's like, no, I'm okay. And she's like, oh, what about for your girlfriend? And I was like, oh, I said, who's your girlfriend? He goes, oh, no. He's like, I'm not here with anyone. Like, I'm by myself in the city. And I was like, whatever, you just call me when you have the capacity to come talk to me about why it is that you're such a liar.
You'd broken up at this stage, right?
Yeah. And for whatever reason, that whole interaction just didn't sit right with me. And I remember I had something on that night and I went out and that whole conversation just kept playing on my mind. And I was like, no, I'm going to go and investigate, use my detective skills one more time.
Mm.
And I had known that he was seeing someone in that very brief period of time we had broken up after the 5-year mark. And I had gone on her Instagram to see if there was a connection there. Perhaps this is the mystery girlfriend he was with. And she had posted that she was away on holidays in Fiji for a week. And I just started connecting the dots. I was like, okay. I'm like, he's called me off FaceTime audio. That means he has no 3G, 4G connection here. He must be calling from overseas, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, he must be overseas with this woman. And so I sent her an inbox, just being really polite as one can be in these moments. And I just said, hey, I know you know who I am. And if you want to line up your story with mine, like, please let me know. Now, I didn't know how she would respond because oftentimes, and you see it all the time in popular culture, you get like two crazy women kind of screaming their heads off at each other. And I was prepared for that, not to be the screaming woman, but prepared that it wouldn't be received so comfortably. But she was quite comfortable in receiving that message and she really wanted to talk. And that's when we started patching our stories up together.
Thank you for tuning into part 1 of this 2-part interview. Be sure to join us in the next episode to hear the rest of Petra's story. You've been listening to Ask a Couples Counsellor, a show that answers all the relationship questions you're too afraid to ask. This show is produced by novoempowercounselling. We provide a range of services, including couples counselling, individual counselling, and online counselling. To find out more, visit our website novoempowercounselling.com.au. This show was produced with strategy and production support from Wavelength Creative. To make sure you don't miss an episode of Ask a Couples Counsellor, be sure to subscribe to or follow the show in your podcast app. And while you're there, I'd love it if you could leave me a 5-star review. It really helps others find the show. I'm your host, Neha Kapoor, and I'll see you in the next episode.